Under the golden light spilling across the Forrester Creations boardroom, a storm was quietly forming. What was meant to be a celebration had become an act of betrayal in Eric's eyes, and no amount of soft music or champagne could disguise the sting. For decades, Eric Forrester had built this empire. Every stitch, every line, every shimmering gown bore his vision, his touch, his pride. Yet now, surrounded by the very people he had molded and loved, he stood feeling like a relic being pushed toward the exit of his own creation. Ridge's decision to plan a surprise retirement party might have been born from concern, even love, but to Eric it was humiliation cloaked as kindness. He looked around the room, Brooke's cautious sympathy, Donna's nervous smile, Carter's diplomatic silence, Steffi's forced composure, and Ridge's determined calm, and he realized that the people he once led were now preparing to lead him away. The moment Ridge began speaking about legacy and rest, Eric felt something sharp twist inside him. His son's voice carried the tone of reason, but beneath it was the sound of finality, a tone that told him the world had quietly decided he no longer belonged. Eric's fingers brushed the edge of the design table, the same table where he had once drawn the first lines of Forrester's Glory, and he felt the tremor of age in his hands. He despised it. He despised the way Ridge's concern sounded more like pity. The applause from the staff outside felt like a funeral drumbeat. When Ridge gestured toward the display of Eric's greatest works, it was meant to honor him, but it only made the air heavier. In that moment, Eric saw not gratitude but goodbye, and rage began to bloom like wildfire. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the chatter, though not loud enough to silence his thoughts. Ridge kept talking about family, health, legacy, but Eric no longer heard the words. All he could see was the reflection of his son in the glass wall, a man who once looked up to him now speaking like a judge handing down a sentence. Ridge believed he was protecting Eric from overexertion, from the risks of pushing himself, but in doing so, he had taken away the one thing Eric could not live without: purpose. What good was rest when the heart no longer had reason to beat? Brooke's voice trembled as she tried to mediate, urging both men to take a step back, but Eric was far beyond retreat. "You think I'm a burden," he accused, not out loud perhaps, but in the way his eyes burned into Ridge's. His pride had kept him upright through grief, loss, and betrayal, yet nothing wounded him more than being treated like an old man too fragile to fight. Ridge tried to defend himself, insisting that he cared about his father's health, but to Eric, the word health sounded hollow. It was not his heart they were worried about, it was his relevance. Ridge, with his new designs and modern flair, wanted to secure his own legacy, and Eric believed every word of compassion was a mask hiding that ambition. Donna, trembling with the helplessness of someone who loved both men, stepped forward, but Eric's fury could not be softened. Years of unspoken rivalry between father and son, between the architect of beauty and the heir who dared to alter it, rose to the surface. Ridge's calm broke, his words sharpened, his stance hardened, and the two Forrester men found themselves facing each other not as family, but as symbols of clashing eras. The younger generation's need to move forward met the older generation's refusal to be erased. The air around them seemed to vibrate with tension. Even Carter, the company's voice of reason, could only stand silently, aware that no legal contract could fix what was fracturing in front of him. Eric's outburst became the thunder that split the room. He refused to retire, refused to accept that his name would be confined to memory or museum pieces. Ridge countered, his words layered with frustration, saying he only wanted what was best. But in Eric's mind, Ridge had forgotten what best meant. To him, the best was creation, the act of designing something that transcended age or time. To stop was to die. Ridge's insistence that his father needed rest was, to Eric, a declaration that he was already dying. And that was the one thing he would never accept. The argument spiraled, each sentence laced with old wounds and buried insecurities. Ridge accused Eric of recklessness, of pushing himself beyond reason. Eric accused Ridge of arrogance, of trying to seize control under the guise of care. Brooke's eyes glistened as she pleaded for them to stop. Donna's hand trembled as she reached for Eric's arm, but neither gesture reached the heart of the storm. Steffi stood frozen, realizing that the very family unity she had worked so hard to preserve was unraveling before her. The office that had witnessed so many victories now echoed with pain. Eric's voice, once smooth with authority, cracked with something raw and human. "You can't take my life's work from me," he whispered, but in the silence that followed, his words were louder than any shout. Ridge's face softened for a moment. The son in him wanted to embrace his father, to assure him this wasn't betrayal. But then the CEO in him reemerged, cold and pragmatic. Ridge tried to explain that stepping back wasn't surrender, it was transition. Eric laughed, bitterly, because to him transition meant exile. The dynasty he had built was being passed on not out of honor, but out of mercy. When the shouting subsided, the damage had already been done. The boardroom felt smaller, suffocating, the walls closing in with memories of sketches, fittings, and triumphs that now seemed like relics of a world that no longer wanted him. Eric turned toward the window overlooking Los Angeles, his reflection ghostly against the skyline. Behind him, Ridge stood motionless, realizing that every word spoken had carved a deeper rift between them. Forrester Creations had always been about family, but in that moment, family became the battlefield. The others exchanged uneasy glances, not knowing whether to comfort or retreat. Donna took a hesitant step toward Eric, her eyes full of tears, whispering that he didn't need to prove anything. But Eric's silence was heavy with defiance. Brooke, standing near Ridge, could feel the ache in both men, one fighting to be heard, the other fighting to be right. The irony wasn't lost on her. Both were driven by love, and both were destroying each other because of it. As the tension thickened, Carter quietly gathered the scattered documents on the table, trying to restore some semblance of order. Yet no contract or policy could mend a father's wounded pride. Eric's hands trembled slightly, but his eyes burned with an unyielding fire. He turned to Ridge with a look that spoke of generations clashing, of ideals torn apart by time. He would not walk away from the company he created, not while breath remained in him. Ridge, frustrated and exhausted, finally understood that reason would not work. This wasn't about business anymore. It was about legacy, mortality, and the unspoken fear of being forgotten. Outside, the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows across the office floor. It felt symbolic, as if the day itself mourned what had been lost between father and son. Brooke placed a hand on Ridge's arm, urging him to leave things for the night, to let time cool the anger. Ridge hesitated, torn between responsibility and remorse. When he finally left, the sound of the door closing felt final, like the end of an era. Eric remained still, staring at the faint reflection of himself in the darkened glass, an artist confronting the slow erasure of his own existence. Yet beneath the exhaustion, a spark of determination flickered. If this was to be a battle for control, Eric would not surrender. He had built Forrester Creations from dreams and defiance, and he would not let his own blood dictate his ending. The thought both comforted and haunted him. Pride had always been his strength, but now it felt dangerously close to being his undoing. Donna, sensing the storm still raging within him, whispered that he didn't have to fight alone. But Eric knew some battles could only be fought in silence, on the sketchpad, in the lonely hours when memory and creation intertwined. As night fell over Los Angeles, Eric sat at his desk, tracing lines on a blank page. His hand trembled, but the vision in his mind was as sharp as ever. He would design one last collection, not for Ridge, not for the company, but for himself. A testament that his heart still beat through fabric and thread. Somewhere in the building, Ridge sat in his own office, wrestling with guilt and duty, knowing that his father's stubbornness mirrored his own. He wanted to protect Eric, but in trying to shield him, he had wounded him deeper than he ever intended. Both men, separated by walls yet bound by blood, spent the night haunted by the same question: how do you protect what you love without destroying it? For Eric, the answer was creation. For Ridge, it was control. And neither could see that their shared love for Forrester Creations was the true cause of their suffering. When dawn returned, Forrester Creations would open its doors as usual. The staff would whisper about the argument, about the rift in the family that built their empire. But behind closed doors, Eric would be sketching again, reclaiming what the world tried to take from him. Ridge, meanwhile, would stand before a mirror, questioning whether his actions were born of love or fear. The war between them was far from over. It had only just begun. And as the city came to life outside, one truth echoed through the heart of the Forrester dynasty: a legacy built on love and ambition can just as easily crumble under the weight of pride. Eric's determination to keep creating would become his rebellion, while Ridge's struggle to lead without losing his father's respect would define his future. In that fragile space between generations, beauty and pain coexisted, woven together, like the finest silk, impossible to separate without tearing the fabric apart. The lights of Los Angeles shimmered faintly through the glass panels of Katie Logan's office, yet nothing about this evening glowed. For years, Katie had lived with an uneasy truce between her mind and her heart, literally. The rhythm of her life had always been dictated by that fragile organ beating inside her chest, one that had carried both love and fear in equal measure. Audiences of the bold and the beautiful had watched her cheat death more than once, seen her collapse, recover, rise again, and swear she would live without boundaries. But tonight, that defiance seemed to falter under the weight of everything pressing down on her. A woman who had been the symbol of resilience was now beginning to wonder whether the very strength she had built her life upon had finally reached its limit. Katie had been healthy for years, strong enough to forget the constant shadow of heart disease that once threatened to claim her. She had rebuilt herself after heartbreaks, divorces, and betrayals. She had found joy in motherhood, purpose in her work, and confidence in being more than just another Logan sister. Yet recently, everything felt precarious again. The stress, the uncertainty, the subtle but unmistakable betrayal from people she trusted, it all gathered like storm clouds behind her ribs. Perhaps it was destiny, or irony, that a woman who spent her life talking about love now found her heart rebelling against her once more. When Katie discovered that her son had become entangled in Luna Nozawa's devastating situation, it sent a tremor through her that went far deeper than maternal shock. She tried to stay calm, rationalize the chaos, and believe it would all be resolved. But every mother knows that fear for her child is the one thing that can shatter composure. Though Luna's pregnancy scare turned out to be a misunderstanding resolved through Dylan's quiet intervention, the damage to Katie's peace of mind was already done. Each sleepless night, each flash of panic, made her remember the hospital monitors, the beeping, the tubes, the moments when she wondered whether she'd live to see her child grow. Those memories had never truly gone away. They'd only been buried under years of pretending she was invincible. But the real blow did not come from family scandal. It came from betrayal dressed in professionalism. Ridge Forrester's decision to replace her at Forrester Creations hit harder than she expected. On paper, it was just business. In reality, it was a humiliation. The company had been her second home, the one place where she could still stand beside giants and prove that her mind, not her medical chart, defined her worth. Yet in one meeting, that illusion was stripped away. Ridge and Brooke called it a necessary transition, a temporary break, insisting that they only wanted her to rest after the turmoil surrounding Luna's death. But behind those polished words, Katie heard a different message, one that screamed you're no longer needed. Brooke's tone was soft, full of familial warmth, but Katie knew that voice too well. It was the voice Brooke used when she was about to justify the unjustifiable. "We just want what's best for you," she had said. But since when did being replaced by an outside PR firm qualify as best? Since when did family care mean exclusion? Brooke's love was always complicated, a mix of tenderness and guilt. Ridge, on the other hand, masked his ambition behind reason. He spoke of image, of renewal, of direction, and though he never said the words, Katie knew he saw her as part of the old guard. In his eyes, she was steady but uninspired, a woman whose light had dimmed. That perception wounded her more than any medical diagnosis ever could. It was as if her years of loyalty had been erased by one decision, one conversation that decided her fate without her input. She felt stripped not only of her job, but of her dignity. How easily they had moved her aside, she thought, like someone rearranging furniture that no longer fit the decor. And yet, beneath her anger, Katie's old fear returned, the fear that her heart would fail her again. The stress, the sleeplessness, the tightening in her chest whenever she thought about Forrester Creations, all of it reminded her that her body had limits. Her doctors had warned her years ago to manage her emotions, to avoid the spikes of adrenaline that came from conflict. But how could she? How could a woman born into a world of passion, rivalry, and betrayal ever live without it? At night, when the house fell quiet and Will was asleep, Katie would sit alone in her living room, fingers pressed to her pulse, listening for irregularity. Every skipped beat sent her spiraling into dread. She'd been through open-heart surgery before. She remembered the smell of antiseptic, the chill of hospital air, the fragility of recovery. The thought of facing that again made her blood run cold. Yet a darker thought haunted her even more. What if this time she didn't come back? People around her thought of her as unshakable. Brooke saw her as the grounded sister, the one who could hold the family together when chaos struck. Bill had once called her his moral compass, though that was long before his arrogance fractured their bond. Ridge likely saw her as capable but replaceable, a professional placeholder. But none of them truly saw the woman behind the composure, the woman who woke up some mornings unable to breathe, who hid trembling hands behind a coffee cup, who smiled through the ache in her chest because she refused to be pitted again. The betrayal from Ridge and Brooke reignited old insecurities she thought she'd conquered. She began questioning her worth. Was she only ever respected when she was dying? Was her illness the only thing that made people treat her gently? The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. When she was sick, people adored her. When she was strong, they forgot her. Maybe she had spent so many years being the survivor that people assumed she no longer needed saving. But this time, her heart wasn't just breaking from physical strain, it was breaking from loneliness. The office gossip reached her ears soon after her dismissal. Some said Ridge simply wanted a new public image for Forrester. Others whispered that Brooke had persuaded him to make the change, using Katie's fragile history as leverage. Hearing that made Katie's stomach twist. To think that her own sister might have used her past illness as a justification to take away her position felt like a betrayal of blood. She tried to tell herself it wasn't true, that Brooke loved her, that she would never be that cruel, but the doubt lingered, growing heavier each day. Days turned into weeks, and though Katie told everyone she was fine, she wasn't. The walls of her home began to feel smaller, her silence louder. The woman who had once stood tall in boardrooms now found herself staring out of windows, wondering when her life had stopped feeling like her own. She began having dreams again, dreams of hospitals, of monitors beeping, of her heart slowing to a stop while voices blurred around her. She would wake up drenched in sweat, clutching her chest, whispering to herself that it was just stress, that she was fine. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. The next visit to her cardiologist confirmed her fears. Her heart showed signs of strain, her blood pressure was unstable, and though the doctor spoke gently, the message was clear. She needed to slow down. But slowing down meant facing everything she'd been running from: loss, isolation, and the painful truth that she could not control everything anymore. Still, there was defiance in her. Katie Logan had never been one to surrender easily. She began researching new treatments, new medications, even considering surgery again, if that was what it took to stay alive, not just physically but emotionally. She wasn't ready to disappear into quiet convalescence while Brooke and Ridge ran Forrester as if she were already gone. She wanted to fight, not against them necessarily, but for herself. There were moments when she imagined confronting Brooke, telling her exactly how it felt to be dismissed in the name of love. She imagined Ridge realizing too late what he had done, that pushing her aside wasn't kindness, but cruelty wrapped in concern. She imagined Bill walking through her door, remorseful, telling her she was still the strongest woman he'd ever known. But imagination could only soothe her for so long. Reality was colder. People had moved on. Yet even as her world seemed to shrink, Katie's courage grew in unexpected ways. She began writing again. Letters she'd never send, journal entries filled with honesty sharper than any public statement she had ever made. In her solitude, she began to see herself clearly, a woman not defined by her illness or her job, but by her persistence. She realized that her greatest strength had always been her capacity to feel deeply, even when it hurt. Still, she could not deny the signs. Some mornings, her heart would race too fast. Other days, it felt heavy, slow, as if each beat were weighed down by years of unspoken resentment. The doctors were right. Stress was her greatest enemy. And yet, the thought of living without passion felt worse than death. When the Forrester Creations newsletter arrived in her inbox weeks later, featuring Brooke and Ridge's new PR team smiling under bright studio lights, Katie felt an ache that went beyond jealousy. It was grief. Not for the job, but for the version of herself she had been while working there, a woman alive with purpose. She closed her laptop, pressed a hand to her chest, and whispered, "Not yet." It wasn't just a refusal to give up, it was a prayer to her own body to keep holding on. If her health was indeed faltering again, then perhaps it was fate's reminder that she couldn't keep living half-truths. Perhaps this relapse, if it came, would strip away what was false and leave her with only what mattered. And maybe, in that process, she would find something she had lost long ago. Faith in herself, not as a survivor, but as a woman still capable of love, creation, and fight. Katie Logan's heart had been both her weakness and her weapon. It had broken and healed, faltered and revived. Now, as she faced the possibility of surgery once more, she stood on the edge of another transformation. Maybe Brooke and Ridge had underestimated her. Maybe they thought they could sideline her quietly. But if there was one thing the world should know by now, it was that Katie never stayed silent for long. And so, beneath the pain, beneath the fear, something in her began to steady, a rhythm, fragile but determined, like the beat of a heart that refused to surrender.